yes, I am in fact child-free. That is the decision that I ultimately made. I am not myself someone who's still on the fence, but I was for a really, really long time. I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree Podcast. Today's podcast episode of the Kids Are Childfree Podcast is actually part 1 of 2, and I will be releasing part 2 of 2 in just a few days. And you're going to be hearing today about the first part of my child-free story, namely a few reflections on my youth, what it was like growing up. Did I dream of becoming a mom? Was I on the fence? How did my ambivalence sort of arrive through my early adult years? And in part 2, you'll have to stay tuned for that, but you're going to hear more about how I actually arrived at the decision to stay child-free. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Kids Are Child-Free Podcast. Today, my special guest is me. I'm the guest. We're going to do a solo episode, and I have these periodically planned for you. The reason being is it's a good chance for me to offer some reflections on what we've been hearing from guests, to also share a little bit of my own story and let you in on my decision to be child-free, as well as some of the relationships surrounding that. Later on in this season, I'm going to be having on my one and only mother. We're going to be talking about my child-free choice. I'm hoping in season 2 to bring on my husband, Chris. So yes, very excited to give you, I guess, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain in terms of how I came to my own decision and what it's like being in this world as someone who has chosen to be child-free. So today we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start with me sharing a little bit about my child-free story. And before we get into that, I thought, as I do with all my guests, I guess I would make a little bit of an introduction about myself. Perhaps I should have brought someone else on to do this for me, but I thought I'd just share a few things about me so you can get to know me a little bit, give a little more context to who is this person that runs this podcast and what is her life all about. So as you may know by now, I am Keltie Maguire. I am a clarity coach living in Munich, Germany. Now, if you're listening to this, you may be thinking, she doesn't sound that German to me. And indeed, I am not German. I actually am a Canadian. I moved to Munich in 2018. So we're coming up on pretty close to 6 years now that I've been living here with my husband and our Mexican dog, Shira, who I'm sure you'll hear much about, if not in this episode, then probably in future conversations. And this is not the first time that I've actually lived in a foreign country. So I spent about a year and a bit living in Sydney, Australia in 2008 and 9. That was prior to when I met Chris. And that just sort of, I guess, bit me with the live abroad bug. And when I met Chris in 2009 and found out that he had recently moved to Vancouver, Canada, from Germany, I was very open to this idea that we would probably move to his side of the world at some point in time. And I'll probably talk a little bit today about how this move came about and how I also see it tying in with this child-free decision and choice that we've ultimately made and that I've made for myself. So what else can I share about me? Well, I am very outdoorsy and active, which is funny in the sense that people who meet me often think I'm this great jock or athlete. And yet growing up, I was not super sporty. I came from a family where we were all really active, but my dad in particular was an incredible jock. He did Ironman triathlons. He was a really good cyclist. He ended up getting his black belt in karate. And I'm someone who specifically team sports that require a lot of coordination, they aren't something that came naturally to me. I was always more the creative mind, the artistic one. That being said, physical activity and being outdoors was something that I was brought up with, I guess, having been instilled in me as very important. And specifically over my adult life, but I would say especially since meeting Chris, my husband, in 2018, we've made spending time in the outdoors such a massive part of our life. So we live in Munich, as I mentioned. We're about an hour from the Alps, and we spend a lot of our time hiking in parts of Germany and Austria and northern Italy. Whenever we travel somewhere, we always like to see if there's hiking trails we can go on. We also have stand-up paddle boards, so we enjoy paddleboarding when the weather is good or when we're somewhere nice and sunny. Although claim to fame is I did go paddleboarding around Christmas and the New Year a couple of years ago when we were in the south of France. And I can tell you it was not warm. And I really was glad I did not fall in. That paddleboarding adventure definitely involved some neoprene booties and me wearing leggings and a warm sweater and all that stuff. So maybe we have more winter paddleboarding in the future, but that remains to be seen. So yeah, we spend a lot of time outdoors. We've recently been getting into ski touring. We love jogging. My husband has gotten into ultra trail running. Not something I plan to pursue, but it's a really big part of our life. And if you have followed me for any period of time over on Instagram, you'll definitely see me sharing photos of our adventures. And I would say this great love of the outdoors we have and our lifestyle, the things we enjoy doing, are something that also plays into this decision. And again, I'm going to talk more about the kids or child-free decision in just a moment. A few other things about me. As mentioned, I have a dog. Yes, I am a dog mom. I don't really think of her as a child, but on the other hand, I do. I often chuckle because, I say to people, we don't have kids. And yet, in many ways, my dog Shira is sort of my baby. I talk to her like she's a baby. I absolutely adore her. She is such an important part of our family. And I really feel like having a dog, getting a dog, is something that made Chris and I a family. And perhaps if you have pets, you can also relate to this sentiment. And certainly a partnership, two people can also be a family. But it's interesting how having a dog, this little unit of three that we have, it really made me feel like I had a family with Chris. And certainly she's a big part of it. Us jointly, Chris and I really love craft beer. So we often love going craft beer tasting. Again, we travel to other cities. We have a favorite local craft brewery here in Munich. Shout out to Higgins. If you live in Munich, make sure you check out Higgins. And what else? I'm like, what else should I tell you? What do you want to know? I mean, hit me up. I find when I share parts of my life, this is something that makes people resonate and relate to my story even more. Funny how that works, seeing the person behind the business and the brand. I can talk to you about the fact that I love eating vegan food. People often ask if I'm vegan. No, I am not officially vegan, although I am, we would say, vegetarian. We try and eat exclusively vegan at home. And when we're out, we sometimes have a bit of eggs and dairy in our diet, specifically when we're traveling or when we're at a restaurant that doesn't have vegan options. But we're really big into healthy, home-cooked, plant-based foods. And so that's another big part of our life as well. I love pizza. I love peanut butter. I love reading a lot. I love time to myself. I would say I present as an extrovert. I'm fairly gregarious and boisterous, but I also really value a lot of time to myself. So that's a little bit about me. All right, so let's get into things. Let's talk about how I came to this child-free decision. And yes, I am in fact child-free. That is the decision that I ultimately made. I am not myself someone who's still on the fence, but I was for a really, really long time. I would say there was probably a good decade of turmoil and consideration that I had to make before I arrived at a more confident choice, probably from, we'll call it my late 20s to my late 30s. All right. So going back to when I was growing up, I certainly have friends who are moms who said that they knew they always wanted to be a mom. And I've also heard from people without kids who say they always knew that having a kid wasn't for them. That just wasn't in the future. It wasn't something they wanted. And I would say for me, I was somewhere in the middle. I would say I assumed that I would probably become a mom, but it wasn't something that I very much fantasized about. Yes, I remember having stuffed animals and dolls and liking to play with them. But for me, I guess part of it was just like an exercise in nurturance and also maybe playing the role of adult a little bit. I think that can be something that's fun for us to try and emphasize when we're young, which of course, when we become adults, we realize it's not always all it's cracked up to be. I remember with my dolls, a lot of it was like enjoying styling them, doing their hair. I liked their clothes. I liked how they looked. And, I try not to let my vanity get the best of me, but I'm still somebody who really enjoys clothing and style and fashion. And I'm a bit precious about my hair. I always like to have my hair done just so. And I've loved trying on lots of different styles. So I guess that's something that showed up for me. Now, I grew up in what we could say is a very conventional nuclear household. We were, I guess, upper middle class, I would say. My dad was a specialist physician. My mom, prior to having kids, did work as a dental hygienist, which is something that she really did not enjoy. And interestingly, she did have other career aspirations or desires for herself before going to school to do dental hygiene. But she was very much of that era that was dismissed. And we still see this with a lot of people, but the idea that, let's say, a creative profession, I know, for example, one of the things she sort of had her sights set on was doing fashion design, that was something that wasn't within reach for her and wasn't necessarily available based on where she was living, etc. So she went the more practical route. She did her schooling in dental hygiene, and she was practicing for, I believe, about 7 or 8 years before she became pregnant with me. And then after having kids, based on the nature of my dad's work, the fact there were 3 children, based on the fact that our family was able to support ourselves on a single household income, and the fact that she really didn't enjoy the work she was doing, she stayed home with us kids. So we've got mom and dad. My parents were always married. My dad did unfortunately pass away in 2018. So he is no longer with us, although probably part of what I'll tell you today will figure into the story and how, maybe what role I see that playing in my child-free decision. All right. So a lot of my clients and followers know that I love outdoor adventures, especially going hiking in the Alps. But a lot of people don't know that I have quieter, more relaxing hobbies as well. And one of my favorite things to do with my time is to read. I love reading all kinds of different books. And my clients know that I usually have a book for virtually every single challenge they may be facing. That's why I've put together my free kids or child-free book guide that contains 22 and counting different book titles, all about how you can make this decision on whether or not you want to have kids or stay child-free. I've included books about the child-free choice. I've got books about motherhood. As mentioned, I've got books about how you can make this decision. I've got fiction books in this guide, nonfiction books. There is a lot to choose from. And for every book that I've mentioned in the guide, I've got a brief description so you can learn a little bit more about the book. And I've also linked to them on Amazon so you can go ahead and purchase them. Although, of course, I would highly suggest you purchasing from an independent bookstore if you can find the title there. Go ahead and download the guide if you're a reader like I am and you want some support making this decision. I know you're going to love the books that I've shared in there as much as all of the people who've already downloaded this guide. You can find it at kidsorchildfree.com under the free resources tab, and I'll also link it in the show notes. I have 2 younger brothers. I'm the eldest daughter. Perhaps you've seen, articles and memes going around about what it means to be an eldest daughter. And I would say a lot of it is true as far as putting pressure on self to behave, to do well, a lot of perfectionism. I don't know if this was expressly put upon me by my parents, but it's certainly something I felt and maybe something I put upon myself. And yeah, basically, being the eldest in the family and sort of assuming that role of setting an example, probably taking care of my brothers. My brothers fought a lot growing up, and I realized that this is something that a lot of people have in their households, siblings fight, but I would characterize a lot of the conflict in the house between us siblings, now that I'm older, as probably being outside the scope of what is normal in a lot of households. And this is not to put blame on any one person in my family, my parents, or anything like that. But I can say that seeing the dynamic in our household, seeing how much my mom took on by nature of the fact that my dad was both busy working and that they had a very quite traditional arrangement as far as her doing most of the stuff on the home front, him being the breadwinner, taking care of things outside the traditional women's realm, more like the yard work, things in the garage, etc. And frankly, as much as my dad was a wonderful man, he wasn't hyper involved as a father, nor a equal partner as what we hear about and see about today. And so what I saw from my mom is that raising 3 children was, in my eyes, something that was immensely stressful. It brought her, I think, quite a bit of stress and heartache, which I know us kids still do today. And that's something I'm sure you'll hear from her when we bring her on the podcast, but that having a child is something that you carry with you, the bad and the good, forever. And I think part of the challenge parents have is learning how to separate themselves from their kids and their kids' ups and downs and heartaches and, the elation as well in recognizing that our kids have their own separate identity and that they're on their own journey, but that can be something very difficult. And so I think what I saw was not necessarily a super rewarding picture of motherhood in particular, but one that was filled with a lot of strife and a lot of stress. Now, the interesting thing is my mom loves being a mom. She is and has been immensely dedicated to us children, and this has been a big part of her identity and her role. But I do have to ask myself what influence that had on me, and that if perhaps things may have seemed a bit easier, or if the dynamics at home, specifically concerning my brothers, were different, if that may have changed things for me. Okay, so again, growing up, the assumption was probably someday I'll be a mom. It wasn't something I thought about a ton. However, I had that initial idea because really this is all I saw. And this is what I hear from so many of my clients and the women that I have conversations with is when we don't see or know any different, how can we really envision something different for ourselves? So for me, thinking about motherhood and having kids, it was sort of a later problem. It was something that I would address and think about later in life. Sidebar, I'm just having a memory come up right now that I had a friend, and I remember her telling me that she had it all kind of planned out, that she wanted to have a girl and a boy. And this is funny. She thought maybe she would name the boy Levi and the girl Jean. Quite funny. We probably were about 10 then. And I don't know if that struck me as like strange or odd or good or bad, but I don't think I had necessarily been having the same thought process as far as like, am I going to have kids? Are they a girl? Are they a boy? What am I going to call them? So anyways, kind of interesting to reflect on. Let's talk about getting a little bit older. So had a series of different relationships. Children were never on the table, through my, call it late teens, early 20s, coming from the upbringing that I did, going to university, doing a degree. The precedence or the emphasis was always in my household of like, you get an education, you get a good job, you support yourself. And something funny, and I'm going to have to ask my mom about that when she comes on the podcast, but I remember her in particular, but my dad as well, saying to me, like, if you get pregnant and have a child, you're going to ruin your whole life. And it's such an interesting thing to say. And I understand the sentiment and the wish for parents not to have, let's say, their teenage children or their young adults to become pregnant, because of course it's like takes your life in a totally different direction. But I do remember my mom saying this to me until I was, I want to say, quite old, like maybe even into my early 30s. If you're going to get, you get pregnant, you're going to ruin your whole life, which is funny because again, I don't think my mom would at all have characterized herself or characterized her life as having been ruined by us kids. And she was about 29 when she had me. But this was sort of a message that was implanted in my head. I also, and sorry, pardon me. My mom's listening for me talking about my mom and not my dad. Okay, sidebar. The story or part of the situation with my dad is my dad and I did not have a particularly emotionally close relationship, I would say. I would say we were close as a family, but he didn't really have much to say as far as the guys I was dating or the choices I was making. I know he wanted me to be secure financially and to have a, quote, good job. Both of my parents were very hands-off, though, as far as how my life should look, the course that it should take, the decisions that I should make. And I am so eternally grateful to them for this because they really gave me free rein to say, like, what do I want to be? What do I want to do? And a lot of safety and security in supporting me in those choices. So my dad didn't have too much to say about me having kids. And frankly, even up to him passing in 2018, I'm not sure if it's something we ever really talked about one way or the other. Would I have kids? Was I thinking about it? Should I have kids? Did he want to be a grandfather? Like, I don't think any of this was, I don't want to say it wasn't on his radar, but certainly it wasn't something that the two of us discussed. So the other thing I want to share that my mom said to me, as she so often would say, I'm not ready to be a grandma. I don't want to be a grandma. And now she's a grandma, and I know she loves being a grandma, but I think part of the reason for that and what had happened in our family, and this may or may not have relevance to what I talk about today, but I feel like it's an important part of my story to tell, is that in 2008, when I was living in Sydney, Australia, my dad had a terrible, catastrophic mountain biking accident, and he ended up breaking his neck, his C2 vertebra, and he became a quadriplegic who was required to be on a ventilator for the rest of his life in order to breathe. And this event, certainly the most traumatic thing that I've experienced in my life and within my family, I would really say it shook the foundation of certainty in terms of what I maybe anticipated life to look like or how I thought it would be. And up to this point, I don't think I ever had the sense or believed, like a lot of us do, that we're immune to things. I think when we see other people suffer, regardless of what's happening, if somebody's sick, if somebody dies, if somebody's going through hardship, it's easy for us to think that's other people, but it's not necessarily us. I think I always innately recognized that this wasn't true. Of course, there's just as much likelihood as things happening to me within my own family, my own friends, but having it happen really rocked me is the only way to describe it. I was 26 at the time. It was about 8-10 months prior to meeting my now husband, Chris. And what that showed me was, again, what we anticipate life in the future may look like can change in an instant. And this has been one of my life's greatest gifts, because it has given me a sense of urgency to do the things I want to do now and to really live out and fulfill my dreams and my wishes. Because I did see certain things with my father and between my father and my mom, for example, trips they planned to take, as an example, postponed for later. And we all anecdotally know, we have this idea, we're told life is short, you don't know what's going to happen. But I think when you experience that, something fundamental really shifts, and it does cause this like, wow, okay. So it's given me a great deal of appreciation in my life for my own, my able-bodiedness, for the movement I can make when I'm grinding it up a mountain, sweating my brains out, thinking this is really hard, I want to stop. I just turn to having appreciation for the fact that I am able to do this. I'm able to be out there, the fact that I am here. But I also think this feeling that, hey, life's not necessarily as we expect it to be, that also is one of many things that I've experienced that led this idea of having children and things being and looking a certain way, and motherhood being the way we hope or envision it to be. It gave me a real sense of like, just because we want something doesn't mean that's going to be the case. And likewise, looking at my own family dynamic and situation, stresses again, conflicts between us as siblings, some of which have ultimately carried on into adulthood. And I don't want to delve into that too much. But I think that recognizing that no thing is a sure thing, while certainly we can take risks in our lives, and I take risks in my own life in different ways, the idealized vision that I see a lot of people having around parenthood and what siblings, those sibling interactions or relationships may look like, I think for me, my life experiences showed me otherwise. And this notion of like everyone in the family gets along super well, and we have this really intact family unit, and we all go together and we do the annual family vacations. Through the accident with my dad and him being disabled for so long, and all of the various fallouts and challenges through that, and how that fundamentally changed him, and it changed the relationship between my parents, and on and on and on. That really drove home that what we want is often very different than what we get. All right, so we got right into it. That's, a little look behind the curtain at some of my own life. And of course, I ask myself, did these experiences, did the messaging I got growing up, did what happened with my dad's accident, did all these things, have they led me to not want kids? And I don't know what the answer is. I think ultimately we are all going to be shaped by the experiences we have, by our genetic makeup, by the things we do, the people we date, the jobs we have, the trips we take, all those things, those little things lead us to our decisions. And so I almost feel like it's a futile exercise trying to kind of pull things apart. However, I do think it's worthwhile to take a look, and for you listening to take a look and say, hey, what was it like within my family growing up? What did I see modeled to me when it comes to parenthood? What were my experiences like with my siblings or their relationships with one another like? Have I had any, adverse events or maybe positive events that maybe have led me to have the views that I do? All right, so that wraps up part 1 of 2 of my Childfree story. Be sure to tune back in a few days' time when I will be releasing part 2 of this 2-part episode. And we're going to get more into the actual decision itself, how I arrived at this decision, what it was like when things really came to a boiling point in my mid and late 30s. So you can look forward to that. As always, please reach out to me. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know if there's any parts of my story in particular that resonated with me. You can find me on Instagram at Kids or Childfree. I'll also link to that in the show notes. And otherwise, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here for part 2 very soon. Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids or Childfree podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child-free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.